Richard Davidson is, by all accounts, not the sort of man you'd peg as a troublemaker.
I'm Richard Davidson, and I'm the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Soft-spoken, slightly bookish, with the kind of curiosity that seems more suited to a dusty library than a revolution, he nevertheless managed to upend the very foundations of modern neuroscience. And he did it by listening to monks.
In the early part of my career, I focused almost exclusively on the negative side of the equation, on adversity, on the brain circuits that were important for understanding why some people are more vulnerable to stress, why others may be more likely to develop a depression or anxiety.
The result, a body of work that not only challenged deeply entrenched scientific norms, but also made meditation, a practice once dismissed by the academic elite as the province of hippies and mystics, a subject of rigorous empirical study. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before Davidson was Dr. Richard Davidson, pioneer of contemplative neuroscience and Dalai Lama confidant, he was Richie, a scrappy kid from Brooklyn. His early years were a mishmash of curiosity and chaos, marked by a relentless desire to understand how people tick. It was in college during the 1970s that he first stumbled upon the idea of meditation. He wasn't immediately hooked. Few are, let's be honest. But something about it lingered in the back of his mind, quietly nagging for attention.
They were people I was lucky enough to meet on the outside. And one of the things that they all had in common that I began to learn about was a practice, an interest in a practice of meditation. And after my second year of graduate school, I went off to India for the first time to get a little taste of what this might be about. And this was back in the mid-1970s.
Fast forward to the Himalayas, where a much younger Davidson found himself lugging a clunky EEG machine up treacherous trails, determined to study the brainwaves of monks who had spent decades meditating in remote monasteries. At the time, it was more of a quixotic adventure than a serious scientific endeavor. Davidson himself describes those years with a hint of sheepish nostalgia. I was an idealistic graduate student with no real plan, just this wild notion that the mind might be more malleable than we thought. The scientific community predictably thought he was off his rocker. Meditation was seen as, at best, a quaint cultural practice, and at worst, a pseudo-scientific waste of time.
We knew that from a scientific perspective, there was a there there.
Yet Davidson persisted, often to the bemusement of his peers.
We can see that a person who meditates for even just 2 weeks, 30 minutes a day, shows a different pattern of brain activity than when they started 2 weeks before. And that is really important.
What he lacked in institutional support, he made up for in sheer determination. And then, in 1992, the stars aligned in the most unexpected way, a meeting with the Dalai Lama. Now, if you've never heard of the Dalai Lama playing matchmaker between spiritual practices and scientific inquiry, you're not alone. It's not exactly a common occurrence, but the Tibetan leader, ever the pragmatist, saw in Davidson a kindred spirit, a man equally committed to understanding the human condition, albeit through very different means. The Dalai Lama issued what can only be described as a friendly challenge. You've spent your career studying anxiety and depression. Why not turn your attention to kindness and compassion? Davidson could have politely nodded and gone back to his usual work. After all, studying the effects of kindness isn't exactly a surefire way to secure grants or impress tenure committees. But something about the Dalai Lama's question struck a chord. It wasn't just a call to action. It was an invitation to rethink the very purpose of neuroscience.
And this turns out to be a very serious problem. Depression is on the rise if you look at trends just over the last few years.
What if, instead of focusing solely on dysfunction, on what goes wrong in the brain, we studied what makes it thrive? Back at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Davidson began what would become one of the most audacious studies in the history of the field. He invited Tibetan monks, some of whom had spent upwards of 30,000 hours meditating, to participate in his research. To put that number into perspective, 30,000 hours is the equivalent of meditating 8 hours a day, every day, for more than a decade. These weren't casual practitioners dabbling in mindfulness apps. They were the Roger Federers of meditation.
Research shows that a lack of purpose predicts an early death. In a recent study, people who were in their 60s with a low sense of purpose had more than twice the likelihood of dying within 5 years compared to people who reported a high sense of purpose.
What Davidson discovered would send shockwaves through the scientific world. Using EEG and fMRI scans, his team found that the monks exhibited sustained, high-amplitude gamma oscillations, brainwaves associated with heightened states of attention, learning, and memory. It was like their brains were playing in a different league, Davidson recalls. We'd never seen anything like it. But the real bombshell wasn't just the gamma waves. It was the fact that these changes weren't confined to moments of meditation. The monks' brains showed long-term structural and functional changes, even during mundane activities. Their baseline state, what the rest of us might call default mode, was one of compassion, focus, and resilience. In other words, meditation hadn't just temporarily altered their brain activity, it had rewired it.
Meditation actually affects. One is attention, and the other is emotion. And what we have discovered is that the circuits in the brain that are important for regulating both attention and emotion can be transformed by meditation.
This is where Davidson's work begins to transcend the realm of academic curiosity and venture into something far more profound. Because if the brain can be rewired for kindness and resilience, what else is possible? Could mental training reshape our ability to focus, to empathize, to recover from setbacks? And if so, why aren't we doing it already? The answer, of course, is complicated. For one thing, most of us don't have the luxury, or frankly the inclination, to spend 30,000 hours meditating. But Davidson is quick to point out that you don't need to be a monk to benefit from these practices. Even a few minutes a day can start to make a difference, he says. It's not about achieving perfection, it's about building a habit. Let's unpack some of the key findings from Davidson's research, starting with resilience. The monks in his studies demonstrated an almost superhuman ability to bounce back from negative emotions. When their amygdalae, the brain's fear centers, were triggered, the activity spiked as expected. But unlike most people, whose fear responses linger for minutes or even hours, the monks' amygdalae returned to baseline within seconds. It's as if their brains had developed an internal reset button, one that allowed them to face challenges without being derailed by them. Then there's sustained attention, a quality that feels increasingly rare in a world designed to distract. The monks' brain scans showed remarkable activity in regions associated with focus, but here's the kicker. They managed this without burning through a lot of energy. It's the neurological equivalent of running a marathon without breaking a sweat. For the rest of us, whose attention spans have been all but obliterated by social media and multitasking, this might sound like science fiction. But Davidson insists it's achievable. With practice, anyone can improve their ability to concentrate. It's not magic, it's training. The findings on emotional regulation are perhaps the most striking. The monks could generate feelings of compassion on command, lighting up specific brain regions as easily as flipping a switch. And this wasn't a fleeting phenomenon. It was a skill honed through years of deliberate practice. Even more astonishing, their baseline brain activity, what we might think of as their default state, was more empathetic than most people can manage on their best days. And then there's the broader implication, the idea that the brain is far more malleable than we ever imagined. Davidson's work has helped popularize the concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. It's a hopeful message in a world often quick to dismiss personal transformation as a pipe dream. If monks can rewire their brains for compassion, why can't we? Of course, it's not all smooth sailing. For all the promise of meditation, there's the inevitable pushback from those who see it as a kind of psychological snake oil. Davidson is the first to acknowledge the limitations of his work. Meditation isn't a panacea, he says. It's a tool, and like any tool, it's only as effective as the person using it. Still, the potential is undeniable. Davidson's findings have already inspired a wave of new research, from schools experimenting with mindfulness programs to businesses incorporating meditation into their corporate cultures. And while the science is still evolving, one thing is clear: the days of dismissing meditation as a fringe activity are long gone. So where does that leave us? If Davidson's work has taught us anything, it's that change is possible, on a scale that once seemed unimaginable. We're just scratching the surface, he says. The real question is, what do we want to achieve? Because the potential is there. We just have to reach for it. And perhaps that's the ultimate takeaway, the idea that our brains, far from being fixed and immutable, are works in progress. Whether we choose to shape them with kindness, resilience, or compassion is up to us. But one thing's for certain, we've never been better equipped to try.